So I think we're live. If you can hear me, put 1 in the chat if you can hear me. I think we're good to go. Excellent. Okay, let's see. Kind of waiting. Stream health. Okay, there we go. So let's get rocking and rolling. Hope everybody's having a good hump day. Let's get rocking and rolling. Let's have a good hump day. So just look at this quick article, then we're going to really talk about Linux and security checks. Get set up, make sure you can see me. Okay. Hope everybody's having a great Wednesday. What's up, CL? How you doing? Nice to chat with you again. So we're about to get started. So let's start by what are security checks for a Linux box? So these are some of the checks we would do for a vendor assessment for a Linux box. We're actually just going to focus on the Amazon Linux 2. I'm really trying to get super involved with the cloud coming up in the 2021. But these checks are really good for any Linux box. We're going to actually talk about the DISA STIG checks, which is the government checks for actually a government installation. DISA STIG stands for Defense Information System Agency, DISA. The STIG is Security Technical Implementation Guidelines. And that's actually the URL at the bottom of the slide where you can actually get to the website to get these particular checks. These checks are government level security. With the FireEye incident and all the government agencies actually getting hacked, let's just talk about a higher level of security and actually what would that look like for a government agency. And usually you can take these checks and usually use them on actually a smaller corporation too also. So this is STIGs, are configuration standards for DoD information assurance. It's IA-enabled devices. The STIG contains technical guidance to lock down information system and software that might otherwise be vulnerable to a malicious computer attack. DoD has released 461 STIG and continue to release more on a semi-regular basis. So the cool thing about this is they get updated at least twice a year or at least yearly, and the DISA STIGs tries to keep up with current technologies. So that's why we like using these in a setting, even for a commercial business, and mostly definitely also for government business. Since we're talking about Linux, these are the different Linux versions that were out there that would actually apply. Ubuntu, the Oracle Linux, Red Hat Linux, Docker, IBM AIX, and Solaris, which was Sun. The AWS Linux 2 is actually a fork of the Red Hat Enterprise 7.11 STIGs. So we're going to use the Red Hat Enterprise 7 STIGs to actually do an assessment on the AWS Linux version of that. So these are the most common ones that are used out here today. Oh, let me get back to there. Oh. So let's get back to there. Once again, it was Linux, it was Ubuntu, Oracle, Red Hat, Docker, IBMS, and Sun Solaris, which is actually owned by Oracle now. They actually bought them out. So let's talk about going to some of the individual STIGs, so we can actually look at what an actually STIG look like, and actually what would you be applying on an actual Linux box. So this is actually a STIG viewer. You actually upload your checks into the STIG viewer. If you look to the right, I'll make that a little bigger. That's Red Hat Enterprise version Linux 7. Once again, the AWS Linux 2 is actually a fork of Red Hat Linux. So we're going to actually look at some of these checks. And these are actually the category 1 checks. So what actually is a category 1 check? So the STIG comes in the Cat 1, Cat 2, and Cat 3. Category 1 is what they say is the highest risk and the highest impact. Meaning, if you don't do these checks, your system probably will be easily hacked, and they could probably initially take over your system. If you go into the description box, I put these top 31 checks actually in the description. It actually has the run title and the vulnerability ID and the category of them. Right, so you can look these up and actually apply them to your current Linux settings. Like I said, once again, this is Red Hat Linux 7, and this actually applies to the AWS Linux 2. The actual other checks are also the actual other version are actually out there, and I actually put the URL actually in the description, so you can actually download any of the other versions of Linux that you want to actually secure your box. So once again, we're going to go over the DISA STIGs. So when we're talking about hardening a box, what does that actually mean? A lot of people, when they talk about hardening a box, they don't actually have requirements for hardening a box. So hardening a box for the DISA STIGs, these are the requirements you would give to your system admin to actually harden that box. Right, so we're always talking about what are the requirements. These are the requirements you would use to give to your system administrator, and they would actually use this to harden your box. So let's look over a couple of these and just talk about them. So the first one, like I said, all these are category 1s. The run title says, the Red Hat Linux operating system must implement NIST Fips validation encryption for the following digital signature to protect data requiring data at rest and data in transit. So what Fips actually means is your encryption you're actually using from Red Hat 7, they actually sent that encryption over to the government for them to actually validate that encryption was actually being used in an appropriate manner. So this is the check you would read through. Then your system admin would actually look. It said yum list to install Fips. And once you run that yum command, it'll actually tell you if the Fips is actually cut on this Red Hat box. Right? You can actually be doing encryption, but Fips is a special encryption, once again, that's validated by the government. You see it where my list at, that's the checksum. That actually tells you the commands to run to see actually if you run a Fips. So let's go to the second check. The Red Hat Linux operating system must enable an application firewall. So the firewall on Linux must be running. Why the host-based firewall? So you want to make sure your firewall is running. So you want to control the traffic that's coming in and outside of your box, and to control that particular part of your system. The host-based firewall usually is it's installed usually by default. Usually you could put source destination in there and the port. You could usually use that for a firewall. Most businesses actually use Cisco or something bigger, but if you're a smaller company, you could actually use the host-based firewall that actually comes with Linux. The Red Hat Linux operating system must not allow unintended or automatic logon to system user interface. Failure to restrict system access to authenticated users negatively impact the operating system. Right, so you should never let any services or users click on a button and automatically have them log in. I know some users try to save passwords into the interface. Sometimes they actually can save them in actually the browser. So this is a check that you need to give to the users and your development team to make sure they're not doing that. And you as the administrator should try to block that. Right, the Red Hat Enterprise operating system must not contain S-host equivalent files. These files are used to configure host-based authentication for systems SSH. So I'm moving it a little bit. Sufficient to prevent unauthorized users. Not requiring interactive identification, authentication to connect the request, or to use two-factor authentication. So the real thing is now with administrators logging in and privileged accounts, you should always make sure they're using two-factor authentication, right? Especially since you're talking about Russia or China actually hacking us with the FireEye tools and Sunburst. So we want to make sure that we're using two-factor authentication when we're dealing, especially when we're dealing with privileged accounts. The Red Hat Enterprise Linux operating system must be configured so remote X connection for the interactive users are encrypted. OpenX displays allows an attacker to capture keystrokes and execute commands remotely. So we're using remote X connection, especially host-based. You want to use encryption so nobody can use a man-in-the-middle attack or be able to take over your connection. Once again, all these checks are in the description box, so you can go out there and get them. I just want to do a quick high level and just go over a few to make sure we understand when we talk about locking down a Linux box or actually doing a vendor assessment review, right? We would give these checks to our vendor, and the vendor would go through assessment of their systems, right? These are high risk, high impact checks. So all these checks should be fixed and not be open or be a finding on your Linux box. The Red Hat Enterprise Linux operating system must be configured so that SSH Daemon is configured only to use SSH v2 protocol. Right, because the v1 is not secure, so you're making sure that SSH they're using, even though they're using SSH, if they're using v1, that could actually get them hacked because that protocol has actually been breached. So we want to make sure, even if you're using SSH, you want to make sure you're using the v2 protocol and not the v1. The Red Hat Enterprise Linux operating system must be vendor supported. So even though you can get Ubuntu, Red Hat, a lot of those are be able to be freely downloaded. Even for open source systems, you want to have vendor support. Why do you want to have vendor support? If there's a security breach like Red Hat or something else, you want the vendor to be able to quickly give you a patch. And the groups that are going to get the patch first are going to be the groups that actually paid for the patch first. So that's why we want to actually have vendor support. The Red Hat Enterprise Linux operating system must not have a trivial file transfer protocol server package installed if not required for operational support. So if verify if the TFTP server has not been installed on the system, don't install it. Usually you don't do the trivial one because the support and encryption up there usually won't meet the level of Fips. So that's why you want to have the trivial file transfer protocol server installed. The Red Hat Enterprise Linux operating system must be configured so that the root account must be the only account having unrestricted access to the system. If another account other than root has UID of 0, it has root authority, giving that account unrestricted access. So you would look in the password file to see if the UID is 0. If any other account has UID 0, that means they have root authority. There should be only one root account and root authority on the box. So we should always make sure we have that authority and those accounts locked down. So obviously we should have, when you log on as root, everything in root should be logged and everything on that account should be logged in. You should force MFA so they would actually have multi-factor authentication with that account. So once again, the system must be configured so the cryptographic hash or file system command matches the vendor's values. Without cryptographic encryption protection, system file commands and files can be altered for unauthorized users without detection. So when the vendor sends files, we need to make sure those files match to the one on our box so we can make sure that there's no additional malware or some other account or procedure or bin account that some nefarious hacker uploaded to our system. The operating system must prevent installation of software, patches, and servers and devices and operating system from a repository that has been digitally signed using a certificate that issued by a certificate authority that is recognized and approved by the organization. So once again, when you get those patches, they should be set up into an approved repository for software and patches that are signed by a certificate authority and approved by the organization. So when you know you're getting Red Hat, you're actually getting it from the source. If you're getting it from a Ubuntu, you're getting it from a paid support user and a paid vendor. The system must be configured so the x86 control-alt-delete key sequence is disabled on the command line. A locally logged on user who pressed Control-Alt-Delete when at the console can reboot the system. Right? So you don't want any user being able to just randomly reboot that system. You want to make sure you control everything on that system, and only the root or administrator can reboot that system. The system must not have file transfer protocol service package installed unless needed. FTP service providers unencrypted remote access does not provide confidential and integrity of a username and password or the remote session. So you should hopefully not use an FTP to ask for transfer files. A lot of people actually like to use FTP, actually encrypt the file, and then send the file encrypted over the FTP connection. But if you do that, the password gets sent over the FTP connection in the clear. Right? So that still makes that file in your system vulnerable. The operating system must be configured. The SSH daemon does not allow authentication using an empty password. So all our daemons must be configured to actually have a password. And two is we actually want to have the password compliance file in there. It has to be a certain length, 10, 2 upper, 2 lower, and 2 special characters, especially when we're doing SSH passwords. The operating system must be configured so file permissions, ownership, and group membership of the file and the command match the vendor's version of that. Right. So once again, you're validating what the vendor sends to you. If you do the RPM and the YUM report, that actually shows you the signature of the file. And here it tells you actually how to check to make sure that version of that vendor file is what they sent you. Right. So you actually want to set up something automated to actually go in there and validate what has been sent to you. The operating system prior to 7.2 with basic BIOS must require authentication upon booting to a single user and maintenance. If the system does not require valid root authentication before it boots into a single user or maintenance mode, anyone who invokes the single user or maintenance mode is granted all the file system in the Grub 2 to default bootloader, meaning you can actually take over and load the boots. So once again, I just want to go over the few of these Cat 1 checks. Once again, I put all these security checks actually in the description. So since we do government level compliance, I just want to go through it so you can see what a government compliance check looks like. And what a system administrator will have to go through and check. Once again, those are in the description. Then actually, last thing I want to do is just kind of highlight this one quick article. We don't want to keep you too long on this lunch and learn. So the Russian/Chinese Linux hackers threaten the national security, says the FBI, NSA. The joint security advisory from the FBI and the NSA is not common occurrence. Neither, for that matter, are Linux security warnings. When there's a joint advisory warning about the previously undisclosed Linux security risk, you can safely assume it's a serious matter, especially when Russian military intelligence hackers, AP-28 is in this case, are involved. Things do not get much more serious than the threat to the national security. It says, I'm quite used to writing about FBI advisories for Windows and Windows vulnerabilities before as well, but I'm not used to a joint cybersecurity venture from law enforcement and intelligence agency concerning a Linux security threat. So once again, nation hackers are actually targeting Linux security more. So that's the reason I just want to go over some security checks for a Linux box. We actually went over the Red Hat 7, which is a fork for the AWS 2 Linux account. So we can just go through these quick slides once again. So what are the security checks for Linux? We went over about 20 of those. All of those are actually in the description box. We call those the Cat 1s. They're the highest risk with the highest impact. That's what we would do for a vendor assessment or software assessment, checking the Linux for our vendor. Once again, we looked at the DISA STIG, which is the Defense Information Security Agency, and the Security Technical Implementation Guidelines. Once again, here's the link to their site. The DISA STIGs are configuration standards for DoD and I-enable systems. The STIG contains technical guidance to lock down information system and software that might otherwise be vulnerable to malicious computer attack. To this date, DoD has released 461 STIGs and continue to release more on a semi-annual basis. The DISA STIGs for the different version of Linuxes are Ubuntu, Oracle, Red Hat Enterprise, and Docker, and IBM AIX, Solaris. Once again, this was a quick lunch and learn. Please subscribe. Thanks for joining me. And I'm sure we're going to be having a few more of these. Thank you very much.